Hey everybody, my name is Tom Tullis. This is the Tomb of 3D Printed Horrors, and today we're going to take a look at hot end maintenance on the Ender-3 V2 Neo. Now, if you've owned previous Creality machines, Ender-3s, CR10s, you'll notice that this is a much different hot end than what those older Creality machines used. They all had those small aluminum, they were red anodized heat sinks. This new hot end, the heat sink is much larger. It's got more cooling fins. There are larger cooling fins on it. And while I haven't tested it, the larger cooling fins will dissipate heat faster, and that will help eliminate heat creep up into the heatsink area, which can cause clogs. So this is a much nicer design. One of the other things they've done is they've put a different Bowden tube coupler on this. The old one was not great. This one works better if you know how to use it and install the tube correctly. And I'll get into that in a minute. I still replace these with the ones I have linked in the video description. They're cheap. They're 50 cents or so. And they just do a better job, in my opinion. And they're not as fussy to work with and try to fight with to get the tube all the way down to the nozzle. And again, I'll go over all this in a few minutes. Another change on this is the heater block is shorter left to right. And again, we'll go over this in just a minute, but that does create an issue with the heater cartridge that you do need to be aware of. Heat break is the same. The insulator slot, sorry, can't talk today. The insulator sock is changed simply because the heater block has changed dimensions, so they give you a custom insulator sock with this as well. The only other change is the wiring now all enters on the left-hand side of the heater block instead of the right as with the previous design. So, with all that covered, let's move on. Okay, so let's move on here. Here's a closer look at the left-hand side of the heater block where the thermistor and the heater cartridge come in. Thermistor is in the rear and the heater cartridge is up front. Here's a close-up view of the thermistor. Now, this is very important. Anytime you're working on the printer or on the hot end, you want to take a look at this and make sure those two the thermistor wires are the ones with the clear insulation on them. Make sure that little bead, there's a glass bead at the end of those two wires, and that glass bead fits into a small hole just below the screw on that left side of the heater block. Now, that bead is what tells your temperature, it tells the machine the temperature of the hot end, and if that bead comes out, it's not getting an accurate reading, and that can cause a thermal runaway. So you always want to make sure that it looks like this. You have that large Phillips head screw. Right below it, you see just a hint of those wires going into a tiny hole. This is what it should look like at all times. If those wires have popped out, then you need to put everything back where it goes. And that means putting the small glass bead, inserting it back into that hole, and then tightening this Phillips head screw down. But you do not want to over tighten it. You just want to turn it until it touches the wires and then stop. Your instinct is going to be to keep turning it and tightening it so it doesn't loosen, and that will crush the wiring and it will ruin the thermistor. It will not give an accurate reading then, and that will create a fire hazard. So all you want to do is just turn the screw until it initially hits the wires and stops wanting to turn, and then stop. Do not turn it any further. That will be the correct way to have this installed, and you can be done with it, but do not over tighten it. Here's a look at the bottom of the heater block. You have two screws on left and right of the nozzle. Those are what connect it to the heatsink. Then you have a small grub screw in the front middle there, and that is what tightens down on the heater cartridge and keeps it in place. Now, This heater block is shorter left to right than the older models. They're still using the original heater cartridge design. And that means with the shorter width, that heater cartridge is going to stick out of one side or the other. That hole that it is in is drilled completely through the heater block. So it would be really easy to have this excess amount poking out through the right-hand side. You don't want to do that because then it's going to be touching the insulator sock. You want the excess amount of the heater cartridge protruding from the left-hand side, like you see here, the side with the red wiring. You do not want it protruding from the opposite side. So we'll move on. Okay, next let's take a look at what the inside of your hot end looks like. Now, in this graphic, you'll see the Bowden tube is red, the nozzle is green, and the hot end is gray. That Bowden tube runs all of the way through the hot end and touches the back end of the nozzle. This is essential for your printer to work correctly and print well. If that Bowden tube is not touching the back of the nozzle, it creates a gap. That gap then fills with semi-molten plastic. That plastic then is very sticky. It's like bubble gum. And it will create drag on the filament as it tries to feed into the nozzle. It will not feed correctly when it's feeding into it. That will create gaps in your prints, and it will also not retract properly for retractions. That will create stringing on your prints. So anytime you're printing and your printer's been working great and all of a sudden you get all this bad stringing, odds are you have a tube separation from your nozzle, and you're going to need to do the following steps in this video to clean it out and reseat it. Okay, so before we get started, I want to show you on this spare stock hot end that I have how to properly seat your Bowden tube if you're going to use the stock coupler that came with your printer. Now, this is straight from the factory, and there is a gap between the tube and the nozzle. And I'll show that to you here. First thing you got to do is use needle nose pliers, remove the blue clip. Now, if there was no gap, this tube would not move up and down when I move it with the clip removed. The fact that you see that ring moving up and down means that there is a gap there between the end of the tube and the nozzle when the ring is in the upright position. So I'm going to show you a way to fix this. Now, even if you push the tube in all of the way, and you see here, it goes down through the entire hot end, it acts as the liner. But even if you apply force to this tube, pushing down on it, and raise the ring up while you're applying force, and that's what I'm going to do here, is I'm going to push down on the tube and then work that ring upwards while I'm still pushing down on the tube and insert this clip in. Even if I'm applying force to the tube the entire time, that ring, this plastic design is not great. It's still going to grip that tube and yank it up away from the nozzle. And I'll show you here. I put force on this the whole time. Now, it's better than it was when it came from the factory, but there is still movement here. That movement is the equivalent of the gap. So there is still, even with applying force, there is still a gap here. So let me show you the way that you can use the stock coupler without changing it out and still get your tube tight against the back. What you're going to do is take the wrench that came with your printer, and you are going to loosen this coupler about 3/4 of a turn. No more than 1 full turn, but 3/4 of a turn should be fine. So I'm just going to loosen that up about 3/4 from where it was. Now I'm going to apply force downward on the tube and insert the clip while I'm applying downward force. That should get it fairly close to where it needs to be. Now go in and tighten the coupler up that last 3/4 of a turn or so, whatever you ended up loosening it. Get that nice and tight. And what that does is as that coupler moves down, it eliminates that gap. And here I'm going to take that out and look at this. There is no play in that tube now. If you're going to use the stock coupler, just loosen it 3/4 of a turn, insert your tube, insert your clip, and then tighten it back down and you're good to go. Okay, moving along, I'm going to show you now how to swap out your nozzle and clean your hot end out. Anytime you change the nozzle and the Bowden tube, you're also going to want to clean out any leaked filament, and we'll go through all of that here. Now, on my Neo, the x-axis carriage drops under its own weight if I'm messing with it, if I'm trying to take screws out, anything like that. So what I do is I put a couple of bottles of paint under the x-axis extrusion like this, and that'll keep it from dropping under its own weight while you're working on it, if yours has the same issue mine does. To remove the hot end fan shroud, you need to remove this screw on the back of the carriage first. Next up, you have two small tabs on the right-hand side of the shroud. These need to be gently pried outward with a screwdriver, and the same for the single tab on the left-hand side. And again, be very careful. Your CR touch is on this side, and the wiring for it, you don't want to snag the screwdriver on this. So just be careful in general when you're prying this out. Okay, to start with, you want to heat your printer up to 200 degrees for the nozzle and remove the filament. Once it is heated up and you've removed the filament, remove the screw on the back of the x-axis carriage. You're then going to use a screwdriver and pry those tabs apart on the fan shroud and gently remove that. Just set the fan shroud up on the x-axis extrusion. The braided cable shroud there, you can slide upward. That'll give you some more slack on your wiring to move things around as necessary. But you can just slide that up a little bit and then slide it back down when you put everything back together. Next up, you're going to want to remove the blue clip. If you're using the stock hot end coupler, you're going to pull that clip out. You're also going to remove the black insulator sock at the bottom covering the nozzle. Just use needle nose pliers or a screwdriver to do that. Pull out your blue clip for the Bowden tube coupler. If you're using the replacement couplers, sorry, can't talk today. The replacement couplers I recommend, you'll have a small zip tie on those to cut and remove. Next, we're going to unscrew the old nozzle. When doing this, you want to use a wrench to hold the heater block in place so it doesn't twist on you and crack the heat break out. Use any 6mm socket to remove the nozzle. This one is just one I've got attached to a small screwdriver handle. There's a lot of different options for that, and I'll cover some of those later. Once the nozzle is removed, you're going to detach the Bowden tube at the rear end next to the extruder motor. So just pull that free. And I'm going to pull it through the zip ties that connect it to the wiring harness shroud. That way the Bowden tube is free. Next, you can just push the Bowden tube down through the hot end all the way through. And what this will do is push out any leaked filament down in that hot end. And you can see some there on the end of that tube. If you pulled it back upward, you would just drag that up with it. So always push your Bowden tube down, and that will help push that out. Next, I'm going to remove the Bowden tube coupler. Just use your wrench to loosen that up, and you can unscrew it with your fingers the rest of the way. So next, we're going to need to cut a fresh Bowden tube. You can use your old Bowden tube as a length reference. Make sure you're using a specially designed tube cutter. That will make sure it cuts flush at a 90-degree angle, so it fits up against the back of the nozzle without any gapping. If you have a gap there, if it's cut at an angle, the filament will fill that gap and cause nozzle drag. Now take your old Bowden tube and keep feeding it through the hot end until it comes out clean. You don't want any dark filament on the end of this when it comes out. If there is, wipe it off with a paper towel and reinsert it again, and keep doing that until it comes out clean, and then we can go through the steps of reassembling the printer. Okay, that Bowden tube is now clean, so we're going to reinstall a coupler on this. I'm putting the replacement coupler that I like to use on. I'm not using the stock coupler. If you want to use the stock coupler, Earlier in this video, I showed you the technique for doing that. It will work just fine for you. I just prefer these, and they come with the tubes. So on these, you're just going to finger tighten it and not tighten it with the wrench until after the tube is installed. So I've gone ahead and put that on. For installing and taking off nozzles, there's a lot of options for 6mm sockets that you can use to remove and put those nozzles on. These are just a few of them here. You can find these all on Amazon, and I'll link them in the video description, but anything like this will work fine. Again, when installing your nozzle, hold the heater block in place with a wrench, and you're going to put the nozzle in until it just touches, and then you're going to loosen it about a half turn. That's it, just a half turn. So now you're going to insert your new Bowden tube, depress the ring on your coupler, and it will feed down. You can get an idea of holding it out to the front about how far it should feed in, so you know for sure you got it in all the way. But feed it down as far as it will go until it's touching the back of that nozzle. And then you're going to go in and re-tighten that nozzle that last little bit. Get it down nice and tight. Hold that heater block in place with a wrench so it doesn't twist on you. Now you don't want to over tighten the nozzle because you can crack it out. So don't do that, but you just want it tight. Next up, we're going to tighten the Bowden tube coupler down. Okay, next we're going to reinstall the heater block, the insulator sock on it. You can just do that. Again, pay attention, this is hot. You don't want to get your fingers near it, but with a screwdriver and some needle nose pliers, you'll be able to put that back on. You could cool the machine down if you wanted. If you're just careful, it'll be fine putting this back on, but you could cool it at this point. You'll just have to reheat it for inserting the filament when you're done doing this. Now, next, you can use the blue clip to hold your top ring on your Bowden tube coupler from accidentally depressing during use and loosening that Bowden tube and letting it slip. I'm not a big fan of the blue clips because they can expand, they can break, and then that will let your tube slip. I really like using zip ties on these things. A zip tie is pretty much foolproof. It will not loosen on you, and then you just cut it off and replace it with a new zip tie the next time you replace your nozzle. But get that hunkered. If you're going to use a zip tie, just make sure it goes up tight under that upper lip, that upper ring on the coupler, and that will keep it from sliding down, and that will make sure everything stays tight and where it's supposed to be. Okay, finally you're going to put your fan shroud back in place, snap the tabs on either side into their grooves, and then finish it off by putting the screw back on the back of the carriage, locking the fan shroud in place. Next, you're going to want to make sure that that Bowden tube is zip tied to the wiring harness. You can either slide it through the older zip ties if you kept those, or if you cut them off, put new ones on. Okay, finally, anytime you change a nozzle out, you're going to want to reset your Z offset. So set the Z offset number to 0 and start over in adjusting it. So you'll go through the process I show in the Ender-3 V2 build video. Go to the end of that video for the Ender-3 V2 Neo. I'll link it up above here, and go through that process for resetting your Z offset. Once you're done with that, re-level the printer and you're good to go. Just as a note, I usually change my nozzles and Bowden tubes and Bowden tube couplers out. I use my machines 7 days a week, all day long. I usually change them out every 4 months like clockwork, because those nozzles do wear down. Through erosion, the opening in the nozzle, the aperture gets larger, and that throws your print accuracy off. So most people can get away with changing nozzles every 6 months. If you use your printer a lot like I do, you're probably going to want to do it every 4 months. In the video description, I have a pack of nozzles I recommend, and then the pack of Bowden tubes and Bowden tube couplers I recommend, along with tube cutters. So anyways, check those out. Thank you for watching. Please click that like and subscribe button.